Welcome to this episode of Communications and Cigars. I'm your host, John Crook. Today is Monday, October 25th. And this is a previously recorded episode. This is the final third one of the last three. So this week, last week, and the week before, they were recorded presentations, installments, however you want to call it, because I've been busy with a few other things on Monday night. So I still wanted to get that out to you. And so I figured, hey, let's get it out there. Let's record it. Let's not skip a week because we're kind of continuing on with a little bit of a theme here for this week. So this week's episode is going to be entitled Ways to Communicate Between Radios. So communication between radios. So how are we going to communicate between these two radios here? And the reason I bring this topic up is because it kind of falls into place with what we've been doing over the last 3 weeks or a couple weeks here. And that, if we go back 2 weeks ago, we talked about the big question. Do you get a handheld radio or do you get a mobile radio? Then last week's episode, we talked about, do you get a monoband, a dual band, a tri-band, a quad band? What exactly do you get for a radio? Because there's a lot of different options out there. Well, now, after we've kind of talked about those two subjects, the next thing I think that kind of comes into play is how are the radios going to communicate to or with one another? So that's what today's topic is going to be. So we're going to use some terminology and everything on there. But first, before we get into that, want to go ahead and, of course, it's communications and cigars. But this week, a little bit of a change. It's a little bit cold up here in the upper Northwest. We've been having some very cold nights, getting down to freezing. We've had our first few frosts. So as you can see, I'm actually in Studio B. I guess you can kind of call it B for the basement. So that's where we're broadcasting from today. So since we're in the basement, not going to be doing any cigars this week. I don't smoke in the house. I only smoke outside or in the garage on there. So it'll be just communications and whatever. I know some people enjoy a Coke or something, but still, if you're enjoying some cigars, or if you're enjoying something else besides a cigar for this installment, make sure you go ahead, drop it into the comments there. Tell us what you are enjoying for a cigar tonight. I did have a cigar picked out tonight. The cigar picked out would have been a Macanudo. I'm a big fan of the Macanudos. It would have been a Macanudo coffee. I like it. It's got a rich flavor, nice, robust flavor on there. It's not sweet, but it has a pleasing palate on there. So I actually ended up smoking it prior to coming down and doing the video here tonight. So with that, one other last quick announcement. If you want to be able to go ahead and send us an email, hey, John, I got a great idea for one of your upcoming shows. Or, hey, John, can you touch on this in one of your shows, one of your episodes? Remember, we're not just about amateur. We're about business. We're about FRS, GMRS, MERS, Marine, CB, businessman, all that, public safety, everything. Make sure you drop us an email. Our email address is communications-cigars@jjkcom.com. So communications-cigars@jjkcom.com. So that's one of our sponsors is JJK Communications. They're nice enough to also go ahead and give us the email. So once again, communications-cigars@jjkcom.com. All right, let's get into the core of today's episode. And before, like I said, we're going to have to do some nomenclature. And that's going to be a big part on there. Because when we start talking about the different modes that can take place, that do take place, that do exist, that's where it kind of gets a little confusing to some people on there. So the first two words we're going to know is direct. And obviously direct is very simple. Direct, meaning from point A to point B. You're going direct. Repeated or repeater, that means it's going to repeat something. So something will come in, a device or something repeats that signal back out. The next one is simplex. And in this case of the term simplex, we're using the word simplex as in one frequency. And next word is going to be duplex. In this case, we're using duplex, meaning two frequencies. And trunking is a term that's going to talk about a system and apply to a system. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the episode here when it comes to dealing with more so your public safety and your business systems. So let's first start out with the understanding of concepts. Based on the type of radio service you're using, whether it be amateur, FRS, GMRS, MERS, CB, Marine, business, public safety, all those kind of things, they will utilize direct communications, and some services will utilize repeated communications, and then some services even will be allowed for trunking communications. All right. When we get in, we talk about repeaters, we'll kind of delve into that a little bit more, but there's two types on there, which we kind of call conventional and we call trunking. So once again, that's going to be a little bit later towards the episode. Now, what I'm going to do is with today's episode, we're going to talk about these things, but we're not going to necessarily talk about how they apply to each individual service. So I'm not going to say amateur radio utilizes this and GMR. No, it's going to be more so of here's the concept, and we'll kind of maybe touch on briefly a little bit about what service does. Now, I'll first start out by saying direct communications, which we're going to talk about, is used on all the different services that are out there. As a matter of fact, there are only some, that is the only mode that some of the services are able to use. So when we say direct communications, we have that category. And then underneath there, we have, in essence, you could say 2 subcategories. And those 2 subcategories are either simplex or duplex. Now, when we say simplex and we say direct communications, we're talking in its simplest form of, hey, I'm on one frequency. I'm using radio A and I'm using radio B. What I'm doing is when I transmit on radio A, I am transmitting on that one frequency while radio B is listening. When I'm done transmitting, I release the push to talk button, and then radio B can respond back to me on that same frequency. Sometimes it can kind of be considered along the lines of push to talk, release to listen. I've heard some people say on there. But basically, since you're only using one frequency, only one radio, one unit can be transmitting at a time. The rest of them have to be in receiving mode. Because if I was to transmit on this radio and this person was to transmit, well, neither one of us are going to be able to hear one another because while these radios are transmitting, they're not receiving. So that is what we would call direct and simplex. Now, that is a very common, like I said, across all the different radio services. Amateur radio has simplex operation, and they'll usually call it simplex operation. FRS and MERS, now FRS and MERS, have, that is the only form of communication. You could only transmit on one frequency in MERS and FRS. GMRS has direct or simplex communications. So does business, so does public safety. CB the same way. It's one frequency that you're using to transmit and receive. Marine does that too, but Marine kind of starts to get into a little bit, and so does business, gets into a little bit of our next type of direct communication, which is called duplex. Now, duplex communication is used in a couple different specific manners, and I'll give you a good case example in a minute here, but to help you understand is we're going to once again be using radio A and radio B. In this case, when I transmit with radio A, I am going on frequency 1 from radio A to radio B. When I am done talking, what's going to happen is I'm going to release that button, and now radio B is going to respond back to me, but instead of using frequency 1, they're going to be using frequency 2. So I'm on one frequency for transmit and one for a different one for receive. This radio B, is the exact opposite. What they are receiving on is what they are, so basically transmit and received here, transmit and receive here. They're different frequencies. And I know that gets confusing for some people, and there's not really kind of a good way to do it because a lot of people don't like, well, how would you use duplex communication? What's a good example? Well, the first good example of a duplex communication would be your telephone. Alrighty. When you're using your telephone, you can hear the person talking and you can also talk at the same time. It's not that, hey, I can only speak, then the other person needs to speak, and then I need to speak. No. If someone's talking and I want to interrupt them or I need to say something right when they're done, I can start talking right away. So that's the whole point of duplex. It's usually transmitting and receiving at the same time, or in this case, you are doing what we call half duplex, meaning you're using 2 frequencies, but you're not transmitting and receiving at the same time. Now, where would that be a good example? Like, how's that worked in the radio world? Well, there's two ways. The first one is marine communications. If you actually look at some marine radio channels, you'll see, depending on where you're at, what channel they are. So if it's, a U.S. or if it's an international marine channel, and then based on which one it is, they will sometimes use duplex communications. In the history of radio, one good case example is IMTS, which is improved multi-telephone service, if I remember correctly. That's what it means. What that basically means is back in the day before cell phones, way back in the day before cell phones, we went along and we had the ability to communicate like a telephone from your car. What happened is you had a handset in your car, but that handset, so it looked like kind of like a telephone handset, went to a radio. And what would happen with that is that the radio would transmit to a base station somewhere on one frequency, and the base station would transmit back to your radio in the car on a different frequency. And then you would be able to connect to this base station, which would then connect to the telephone lines. And then once you did this, you basically had a duplex conversation that took place. You're holding the phone up to your ear, the handset up to your ear, and then that was a cord that was, like I said, attached. And this radio device was huge. It was like in your trunk of your car. It took up a lot of room, and it wasn't anything small or anything like that whatsoever. It's not like cell phones were today, or even the bag phones that first came out for cell phones. It wasn't anything that small. It was pretty big, because they operated in like the 35, 30 megahertz range, the VHF range, as well as the UHF range. Now, the reason that it had to operate that way is because it wanted to give the operation of a telephone. So that's why it used duplex communications, and it used it as full duplex communications. So the moment that my radio was transmitting, it was also receiving at the same time. This later on is kind of you'll hear duplex, and we're going to talk about that in our next part, which is repeaters. But for all purposes right now, understand that direct communications, meaning not using a repeater, not using anything except going from radio A to radio B, you can have simplex, which is the same frequency used for transmit and receive, or you can have duplex, which is using one frequency for transmit and one frequency for receive. So that's it for direct communication. So that's that one group. So let's move on to the next group. And the next group is going to be repeater or repeated communications. More so conventional repeated communications. Now I'm going to switch this up a little bit, because just as simplex is more of a common type of direct communications, duplex is the more common type of repeated communications. What we're talking about in that case is that now when we have a repeater, what we're doing most often is transmitting on a radio on frequency 1. The repeater is receiving that and simultaneously transmitting it out on frequency 2. Now, the reason that this needs to work in the repeater is because we want instantaneous communications. So the whole point, obviously, of a repeater is to have my radio. So I have my little, let's say, 5-watt radio here. And let's say I'm in my basement, which I am, and I want to talk to my friend maybe 15, 20 miles away. Well, am I going to be able to take this radio and key up and talk 15 miles away from this radio out to that other radio? No, unfortunately, not possible. All righty. Even though some radio packages will say that's possible, it's actually not possible. On paper, yes. In the real world, not. And we'll explain that a little bit later on, too. So now what we're doing is we're taking this radio, we are keying up on it, and my 5 watts is going out because I can hit the tower, because usually repeaters are on high locations, like tops of tall buildings, up on towers, 100, 200, 300 feet, however tall the tower may be. And basically, it's, for the most part, a repeater is 2 radios that are working together. One radio receives, one radio transmits. So in this case, I am taking and transmitting from my radio, radio A, into the repeater. The repeater's taking that information in, and then it's repeating it back out with increased power and from an increased height. Now it's going out over frequency 2 to radio B, and now radio B is hearing that communication and that transmission from me wherever I may be. Once I'm done transmitting, now radio B will go ahead and key up on the radio, but this time they're going to still use frequency 1, because frequency 1 is always used to talk into the repeater, and frequency 2 is always used to transmit out of the repeater. So therefore, when you program a radio, you're going to have to program a transmit and a receive tone into the radio, and then that's going to allow you to communicate on there. Now, of course, the difference between a repeated communication and a simplex communication is now you have a different device that is actually in the works to make it work. Meaning, if you don't have a repeater, you cannot communicate on that repeated channel because you're always using the same frequency in to the repeater, frequency 1, and it's always using the same frequency out, frequency 2, and you can't switch them. Alrighty, that's always the way that it is. So when you are on a repeated channel, you have to use that repeater, and your limitations then are actually range, much like a simplex direct communication is. Now, let's talk about simplex repeating. And the reason I brought up simplex repeating as the second type of repeated communication is because it doesn't really make sense. If I'm repeating something, I can't transmit and receive at the same time, right? If I'm using only one frequency, much like simplex direct, if I'm transmitting on my radio on simplex, this other person can't transmit back because I'm not going to hear it. So how does that work with the repeater? If a repeater is receiving, how does it transmit out? So that's where simplex repeaters are kind of interesting. I've used simplex repeaters in the past for various jobs that I've had. I used a low band simplex repeater, and that thing just reached for miles upon miles upon miles. But they are still in use, and sometimes you'll hear them called store and forward repeaters or devices. This usually has been used in business or public safety applications. So the way a simplex repeater is going to work is that I'm going to be radio A here. I'm going to transmit on radio A into the repeater on frequency 1. So I'd be like, hey, unit 1, this is unit 4. Once I unkey, the repeater then stops recording. So it's basically recording the conversation. And once I'm done talking, then the repeater is going to repeat it back out and saying, hey, unit 1, this is unit 4. So if I'm on my radio, I'm going to hear myself just come back. But in all reality, that is going out because it's more power and it's going to go up at a higher elevation because the antenna and everything, that's going to go out over the air. Now what's happening is the unit 4 is here. Hey, unit 1, this is unit 4. So hey, unit 4, this is unit 1. Hey, so now we're going to change it here. Change it. Okay. Go ahead, unit 1, this is unit 4. He just repeated or talked into the repeater. Now that's recording it. And then once he's done talking, the repeater is going to repeat out, go ahead, unit 1, this is unit 4. So on my radio, I'm going to hear, hey, unit 4, or hey, unit 1, this is unit 4. But what you're not seeing here, what it's kind of hard to demonstrate unless you actually have a simplex repeater, is that when I'm talking initially into the repeater, unlike a duplex repeater, this user is hearing nothing at all. When I'm done talking, then he'll hear the repeater transmit. Likewise, when he calls back into it, I'm sitting here waiting, hearing nothing, hearing nothing, hearing nothing. Then once he's done transmitting, the repeater is going to repeat it back out, and I'm going to hear it. Simplex repeaters aren't that effective for two-way communication, so meaning talking radio to radio. More so, simplex repeaters have been used, once again, in the guise of public safety systems. And what I mean by that is that, once again, that term store and forward. So what you have is think of this. Think you have a big business, and say you have 3 warehouses as part of that business. And let's say you have a paging system that goes, and you want to reach to all 3 different warehouses. Let's say they're kind of spread apart. Let's say they're over a half a mile or so, big campus there, all right? So now what's going to happen is when they send out a page, well, let's say the transmitter's on building 1, and the transmitter goes into building 1 and can transmit into building 2, but building 3 is a little further away. So if you're inside building 3, your pagers aren't probably going to go off because that's antennas on top of building 1. It's got to go the distance, plus it's got to go through the building. And if it's a metal building and all these different things, it can be problematic. So what happens on a simplex repeater, or a store and forward in this case, is that page goes out for building 1 and building 2. And then on building 3, it has that simplex repeater, store and forward. It's receiving that signal. Once that signal is done, then it can transmit into the building. That's how, like I said, a lot of stuff has been done in the past. When paging was really big, a lot of those networks were store and forward on there, especially if you had a huge, massive network that spanned numerous different sites. Paging services used to have huge areas of coverage. I had a voice pager for the longest time, and some of that was store and forward, depending on how big the coverage area was. Sometimes if I was right in between coverage, my pager would kind of go off a little scratchy and then would go off nice and solid because it went off on the main signal first, and then it went off on that store and forwarded location that I was at. So now let's review Simplex and Duplex for direct communications, meaning radio, and then we have Simplex and Duplex for repeated communications. So now, what is going to be used the most? Well, when we talk about duplex repeaters, that's kind of like amateur repeaters. Those are GMRS repeaters. Those are going to be business repeaters. Those are going to be public safety repeaters and everything like that on there. So that's where repeaters are usually used. And like I said, it all depends. Some people use direct communications, Simplex, and some people will use repeated communications. Which one is the better? Well, once again, it kind of depends on kind of how we talked about it the last couple of weeks. Is there a repeater close by? What is the power of your radio? The capabilities in that regards. But let's jump into what we call trunked repeaters real quick, or trunked radio systems. Now, what happens when we get to trunked systems? Trunking technology, and the reason they call it trunking is because you basically have repeaters that are connected together. So instead of having one repeater, what's the term, conventional repeater, linked together, you have a couple of repeaters linked together. And what happens in a trunked system is just like your telephone system, kind of how it is. They have trunked lines. So when we all had landlines, so maybe you've never had a landline, but for all those of us that did, when we'd pick up our phone and we'd hear that dial tone, that means we had a signal path to go down there. And they would have what they call trunks that would go down there. These trunks, in essence, would allow you to call out on the different connections out there. All right, that's how they routed your calls. So the term trunking comes from saying, okay, well, now I have not just one repeater that I can have a voice conversation come over, but I can have multiple repeaters that the conversation comes over. Now, you're saying, well, wasn't that just a bunch of conventional repeaters? Yes. So here's how it works. Let's say let's say the communication system is for, let's say, a mall, okay, or a big business facility. You may have security, which needs their own channel. You may have maintenance, which needs their own channel. You may have custodial that needs its own channel. You may have administration or office staff that needs its own channel. Well, that's 4 different channels that you're talking about on there. So obviously, if you have 4 different channels for different people to use, you're going to come into some time where it's going to be kind of a crash of systems, right? So security needs to talk to security, but maintenance was using that same channel, and facilities was using that same channel, and it's just going to get crowded up because people are not going to have airtime. But what the problem happened is that when you're putting all these repeaters at one site and you need to communicate across different groups of people, like let's say I'm a security officer and I need to talk to administrative staff. Well, the question comes then is, do I stay on channel 1, which is security for me, or do I go to channel 4, which is the administration staff channel? And then once I talk to administration staff, do I stay on their channel or do I go back to my channel? Likewise, if admin needs to get a hold of security, does admin go to security or does admin stay on admin? So then it gets really confusing because if there's multiple channels to be used, well, if my main channel is busy for security, right? Maybe I need to talk to another security officer about something else than what's going on. So now I have to find an open channel on the system. That's where they said, you know what? Let's do trunking. And trunking is basically, instead of having 4 individual repeaters, we're going to link all 4 of them together. Now, I'm not going to, in this episode, delve into the abyss of the different types of trunking systems that are out there. There are numerous trunking systems out there. There is LTR, there is EDAX, there is Smart Trunk, there's analog systems. I mean, there's There's tons of different types of trunking system, and a lot of them are based upon the manufacturer. I'm talking about simple concepts right now. So if some people are watching, they're saying, no, that's not how it works. No, we're talking about it at the 10,000 foot level. Now what's going to happen when I trunk is that my radio is going to be programmed to a special way. And it's going to be programmed for what we call a talk group. Alrighty? And then that talk group is how this radio is going to operate to call into the system. So still staying at that 10,000 foot level here, instead of me going in on that same frequency 1 and frequency 2 for that repeater, now what's going to happen is I'm going to key my radio, and frequency 1 and frequency 11 might be for repeater 1, and frequency 2 and frequency 22 might be for repeater 2, and 3 and 33 and 4 and 44. Does that make sense on there? So they're using repeater frequencies per the repeater. But what's happening is with the trunk system, it's automatically letting me know as to what frequency I need to know. And that's, once again, the different technologies that do that. But trunking is a little bit different in that regards, because usually with the conventional repeater, we're using that one frequency in and one frequency out. Where with trunking, we are using a same frequency in and a same frequency out, but each time I key up, I might be on a different repeater. I may key up and initially say security 1 to dispatch. I might be on repeater 1. Dispatch, go ahead, security 1. They might be on repeater 2. I key up and saying, yeah, I've checked the area and everything's good. Now I might be on repeater 3. They key up, reply back. I might be on repeater 4. You see what I'm saying? So it kind of moves those repeaters, and that's how trunking works. Same concept of a frequency in, a frequency out, but now we, in essence, have multiple frequencies and multiple frequency outputs on there to kind of go along. Now, what are those used? Well, those are usually used on business systems and public safety systems. There's not really trunking in the amateur world. There's no trunking in GMRS. Obviously, if you're not a radio service that can use a repeated system, then, meaning like Marine or FRS or MERS or CB or something, well, you're not having a repeater, so you're not going to be trunking anyways. But that's just a different type of repeater system, of a different type of means of communicating on there. So that's what today's episode has kind of been about. It's kind of starting to get more of an educational information type episode, not necessarily one for a discussion. And the reason I wanted to do this is because I've started to see, especially with a lot of the scanner users out there, seen a lot of questions that are starting to come up. How do I program this? What's the difference between this? I see, radio reference or repeater book or whatever the case may be. Some radio system user will be saying, well, why do I have to program in this channel? Only one frequency for transmit and receive, where I need to program in another for transmit and receive, separately. And that's kind of where it kind of comes into play. So if you have questions, if you contribute to the chat, let's talk about this on there. This is that kind of gets a good educational point, especially if you're not into a radio service, or maybe you are into a radio service and you want to expand. Maybe you want to get an amateur. Maybe you want to know a little bit more about business systems. Hey, you're a scanner enthusiast and you want to know why these systems are set up the way that they are. This is a good, I think, learning point on here. Future episodes, we're going to be delving more into understanding trunked radio systems. We're going to be delving more into digital voice systems and everything dealing with communications overall, not just one specific service or type of communications. Once again, if you have any comments or you want to send me an email, ideas for a show or something like that, make sure you can email us. Email address is now communications-cigars@jjkcom.com. Once again, communications-cigars@jjkcom.com. Thank you for watching this recorded episode. Next week, Monday, we will be back live, probably in Studio G, because I think it's going to be too cold by then, but we'll be enjoying a cigar then. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Make sure you leave it in the comments on there and subscribe to my channel. I appreciate it very much. Until then, stay safe, and we'll talk to you later.